It was the kind of winter morning that painted the world in a colorless haze, where the air was so cold it seemed to slice straight through the layers of clothing, where the frozen lake stretched endlessly like a sheet of glass under a sky heavy with falling snow, and in that vast white silence there was movement. A small shape against the endless horizon, sitting still as if carved from the ice itself. A German shepherd, his coat dusted with snowflakes, his dark eyes locked not on the shore where people might have been, but on something beside him, something hidden beneath a mound of snow. And if you were standing there, you might have thought, it was strange, a dog alone in the middle of nowhere, 5 miles from the nearest land, in a place where no one should have been, in a place where the ice could give way without warning. And yet there he was, not pacing, not barking, just watching, as though the world around him had narrowed down to that one spot, the sound of the wind carrying the occasional groan of shifting ice. And far in the distance, a faint hum began to rise, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a place so still. Growing louder, closer, until 2 figures in bright orange appeared, crouched low in a red inflatable rescue boat, their breath turning to frost as they leaned into the oars. Their faces tight with focus because they already knew the report that had brought them here was unusual. A call from a fisherman who had spotted the dog at dawn and thought maybe it had wandered too far out. But even from shore, the way the animal sat so still had unsettled him. So he called for help. And now, as the rescuers approached, the snow thickened, making the dog seem like a ghostly figure, almost unreal, until they were close enough to see the rise and fall of his breath, the wet glint in his eyes, the frost forming on his whiskers, and they called out, their voices barely carrying over the wind, expecting him to turn toward them, maybe even run to the edge of the ice. But he didn't move. He didn't even flinch, and in that moment they realized he wasn't stranded by accident. He was here for a reason. And whatever was under that mound of snow, it mattered to him more than his own safety, more than the freezing water lapping at the edge of the ice sheet, and as they slowed the boat, the front of it crunching softly against the ice. One rescuer leaned forward, studying the shape beside the dog, a lump half covered in powdery snow, the edges darkened as though something was wrapped beneath, and the rescuer's mind raced with possibilities. But before he could take another guess, the dog's gaze shifted, not to them, but back to the object, his body leaning ever so slightly toward it, a protective motion so instinctive it made. The rescuers paused, and in that pause the wind seemed to howl louder, the ice groaned deeper, and the vast emptiness of the lake closed in around them, making them realize that whatever they were about to uncover here would not just be another routine rescue, and somewhere in that heavy silence, with the snow stinging their faces and the cold biting into their hands, they felt it. That strange, unshakable truth that this dog wasn't just waiting to be saved, he was waiting for them to understand, to see what he had been guarding all this time, and though they didn't know it yet, what they would find would change them forever. Now, before we go further, I want to know from you, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because this is the moment where you'll want to keep watching, where every detail matters, and trust me, you have never heard a story like this before. The boat rocked gently against the jagged edge of the ice sheet as the 2 rescuers steadied themselves, their boots crunching onto the frozen surface, each step sending a faint echo through the layers of ice beneath. And though both men had been trained for situations like this, there was something about the stillness of the German shepherd that unsettled them in a way no raging storm or capsized vessel ever had. Because dogs stranded on the ice usually barked, cried out, or tried to run toward safety, but this one remained perfectly still, his breath slow and steady, his gaze never leaving the mound at his side, as though the humans approaching were nothing more than background noise to the mission he had set for himself. And the closer they came, the more they noticed how the snow around him was packed down, not just by his own paws, but by movement, by the subtle shifting of weight, as if he had been circling that spot again and again through the long hours of the night, guarding it against the wind and the bitter cold. And one rescuer, a man named Jack, who had been with the department for over a decade, lowered himself into a crouch, speaking softly. his voice carrying that gentle, coaxing tone he used when approaching skittish animals, telling the dog it was okay, that they were here to help. But the shepherd's ears twitched only slightly, his eyes flicking toward Jack for the briefest. A moment before returning to the mound, and that was when Jack saw it. The faintest trace of something not snow, not ice, but fabric, pale and stiff with frost, protruding from the edge of the drift. And his stomach tightened in a way that training could never prepare him for, because instinct told him that this was no lost piece of debris, that whatever lay beneath had weight and meaning, and perhaps a story far darker than they had imagined. But before he could reach for it, the dog moved, just a small shift forward, his chest lowering slightly as if to shield it from view, and Jack froze. Not out of fear of the animal, but out of respect, because there was no aggression in that movement. Only a deep, protective certainty, and the other rescuer, a younger man named Kyle, stepped closer. His boots squeaking against the thin glaze of snow, his breath clouding the air as he whispered to Jack, asking if they should try to pull the dog away. But Jack shook his head, because something in his gut told him that breaking that trust too quickly might cost them the truth. And so they waited, letting the wind whip around them, letting the dog smell them, study them, decide for himself if they were worthy to be let in on this secret he had been guarding. And in that endless minute of silence, Jack's mind drifted to the fisherman who had spotted the dog at dawn, wondering if he too had felt this strange weight in the air, this sense that something monumental lay just beneath the surface. And then, as if making a choice, the shepherd took a single, slow step back, his body still angled protectively, but now allowing Jack to kneel closer to the mound. The snow clinging to his gloves as he brushed it away, revealing more of that frozen fabric, its color dulled by frost, its edges stiff. And as the pattern emerged beneath his fingertips, Jack's breath caught, because it wasn't just any cloth. It was a small quilt, the kind you might find in a child's bedroom. Its pastel squares faded but still visible, and the sight of it here, miles from shore on a slab of ice, was so wrong that it made his chest tighten. But there was more, something beneath the quilt. And as his fingers traced the edge, the shepherd leaned in, his nose brushing the spot, his breath warm against Jack's hand, almost as if to guide. Him and Jack swallowed hard, glancing at Kyle, who gave the smallest nod. And together they began to lift the corner of the quilt, the cold biting into their skin, the weight beneath making the fabric shift in their hands. And though neither man said it aloud, both of them knew in that moment that, whatever they were about to uncover, would explain everything. Why the dog had stayed, why he had risked the ice, why his eyes held that unshakable focus. And somewhere in that frozen silence, the truth began to take shape, a truth that would haunt them long after they left this lake. Now, before I go on, I want to know from you, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because what happens next will make your heart race and your eyes well up, and you won't want to miss a single second of it. The quilt was heavier than it looked, the frozen moisture locked into its fibers, making it stiff and unyielding. And as Jack and Kyle lifted the corner, the frigid air seemed to grow sharper, the world around them narrowing to the space beneath. That fabric, the muffled crunch of their gloves against ice sounding impossibly loud against the vast quiet of the lake. And for a moment they hesitated, not because they feared what they might find, but because there was an almost sacred weight to the dog's vigil. As though disturbing it too quickly would be a violation of something deeply personal, yet the shepherd did not growl or step forward. He simply shifted his head, watching them with a gaze that was steady and unblinking. And when Jack finally peeled back more of the quilt, the first thing he saw was the curve of something round, small, and pale against the contrast of frost-darkened cloth. And at first, his mind could not place it, because the human brain has a way of rejecting shapes that should not be here. But then his chest tightened as recognition crept in, and he realized it was the rounded edge of a small plastic sled, the kind children pull behind them on snowy days, its red color dulled and frosted over, a frayed length of rope still knotted. To the front, the fibers stiff and frozen, and the sight of it, here, on this unstable raft of ice miles from shore, sent a ripple of questions through his mind. Because sleds belong in backyards and gentle hills, not in the middle of a frozen lake, where the wind cuts like knives. And as Kyle crouched beside him, brushing more snow away, they uncovered what lay atop the sled, a small bundle wrapped tightly in an old wool scarf. Its once bright threads muted to gray by frost, and both men paused, their breath catching, as the shape beneath the scarf revealed itself to be not solid ice but something softer, yielding slightly under Jack's gloved hand. And before either could speak, the shepherd leaned closer, his nose pressing lightly to the bundle, his breath warm in the freezing air, his eyes flicking between the men and the object as if urging them to see, to understand. And the silence in that moment was so complete that even the far-off groan of the lake seemed to fade, replaced by the faint rustle of the scarf's threads as Jack carefully loosened them, his fingers moving slow and deliberate, and with each turn of the fabric, the bundle's true nature began to emerge, revealing the delicate curve of something pale, too pale, almost like porcelain in its smoothness. And Jack's pulse quickened, because in the smallest of details, the faint imprint of stitching from the scarf pressed into the surface. The soft indentation along one edge, he began to understand what he was holding. And yet his mind resisted the full truth because it seemed impossible. And then, just as he prepared to pull the scarf away completely, the ice beneath them let out a deep, resonant crack that vibrated up through their boots, a reminder that their time here was not limitless, that each second brought them closer to danger. And Kyle's eyes darted to the widening fracture just beyond the edge of the floe, his voice tight as he told Jack they needed to move, but Jack couldn't, not yet, because the shepherd had lowered himself onto his haunches, his head now resting lightly against the sled as if to keep it from shifting, his body language radiating a kind of desperate patience. And it was in that silent plea that Jack understood they were not just rescuing a dog today. They were bearing witness to something much larger, something this animal had chosen to protect at any cost. And though the snow was thickening, stinging their cheeks and blurring the shore, the men knew they could not leave without knowing exactly what it was he had guarded through the night. So Jack tightened his grip on the bundle, lifting it gently from the sled, the weight surprisingly light in his arms, and he turned toward the boat with Kyle at his side, the shepherd rising to follow, his movements slow, careful, his eyes never leaving the bundle. And as they stepped gingerly toward safety, Jack's mind swirled with unanswered questions, each one heavier than the last. Now, before I tell you what they discovered when they reached the boat, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now, because the moment they peel back the final layer of that scarf will be one you will never forget. The wind seemed to push against them as they made their way back toward the boat, each step across the groaning ice measured and deliberate, the red inflatable shifting slightly with the movement of the water beneath, and Jack could feel the light but undeniable weight of the bundle in his arms, the cold from it seeping through his gloves as if whatever lay inside had been part of the lake itself for far too long. Kyle moving ahead to steady the boat while casting quick glances over his shoulder at the shepherd, who followed so closely behind Jack, it was as though an invisible tether bound him to the bundle, his eyes never breaking contact with it, his paws silent against the snow-crusted surface. And when they finally reached the boat, Kyle braced it while Jack stepped carefully inside, lowering the bundle onto the bench seat with a reverence that surprised even him. 'Cause in all his years of rescue work, he had handled fragile equipment, injured wildlife, even the bodies of those who hadn't made it home. But never had he felt this strange blend of urgency and tenderness, as though disturbing the bundle too abruptly would fracture something far more delicate than bone. And the shepherd, after a brief hesitation, leapt lightly into the boat, landing beside the bench and curling his body protectively around it, his breath fogging in the freezing air, his ears swiveling at the creak of the ice as Kyle pushed them away from the floe, the rhythmic churn of the small outboard motor cutting through the muffled quiet. And for a while none of them spoke, the snow falling thicker now, softening the horizon until the shoreline became a shadow. And Jack found himself staring at the scarf, tracing the faded weave with his eyes, noting how it was wound with a precision that suggested care rather than haste. And that detail lodged itself in his mind because it meant that whatever had been wrapped inside had been placed there intentionally, not abandoned, not lost, but preserved, And as they drew closer to shore, the shepherd shifted, pressing his muzzle gently against the fabric, as if checking that it was still there, still safe, and Jack felt a flicker of something in his chest. A pull toward the truth he knew he would uncover soon, because he had seen this look in dogs before. The gaze of an animal who has chosen a role and will not let go until it is fulfilled. And when the boat's bow scraped against the icy edge of the dock, a handful of waiting volunteers stepped forward, their faces etched with curiosity and concern, one of them reaching out to lift the bundle. But the shepherd rose instantly, placing himself between the stranger and the seat, his posture calm yet unyielding, and the volunteer froze, his eyes meeting Jack's in a silent question, and Jack nodded faintly, indicating that they should wait. Because this was no ordinary find. This was something the dog had decided to entrust only to those who had earned it, and so Jack knelt beside the bench, speaking softly to the shepherd, telling him they were almost there, that it was okay now, his gloved hands moving slowly to untie the scarf, the threads crackling faintly as they released after being frozen in place for so long, and with each layer loosened, a faint scent of wool and something older, something faintly metallic, drifted into the air. Mingling with the sharp cold, and the dog's eyes tracked every movement, his head tilting slightly as though remembering the moment this scarf had first been tied. And as the final knot slipped free, the fabric fell open to reveal not a single object but a small cluster of items nestled together, each one telling a fragment of a larger story: a child's mitten, pink and worn at the fingertips, a folded piece of paper sealed in a clear plastic sleeve, and something small and cylindrical that glinted faintly under the gray sky. And the sight of them together made Jack's breath catch, because these were not random things. They were deliberate. They were the kind of items a person would keep close when they mattered more than anything else. And though the questions in his mind multiplied, one truth became immediately clear. Whatever had happened out on that lake, this shepherd had not been stranded by chance. He had been guarding these pieces of someone's life, holding vigil through a night that could have claimed him too. And as the volunteers gathered closer, their faces softening with the weight of what they were seeing, the dog finally eased back, his body relaxing just enough to let Jack pick up the mitten, turning it over in his hand and wondering whose small fingers had once filled it. Now, before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there, because when I tell you whose story these items belong to, it will change the way you see this dog forever. Asterisk. The mitten felt impossibly small in Jack's gloved hand, its faded pink yarn rough from years of wear, and as he turned it over, a loose thread dangled like a fragile tether to some long-forgotten day, and he found himself imagining the hand it once warmed, tiny fingers curling inside against the cold, perhaps gripping a sled rope or clutching a parent's coat. And as his thoughts wandered, the shepherd shifted slightly, his gaze fixed on the mitten, as if willing Jack to understand. And Jack set it gently back with the other items before picking up the plastic-sleeved paper. Its edges creased, the faintest smudge of ink visible through the frost-fogged sleeve. As he pulled it free, the cold air bit at his skin, the paper stiff but intact, and he unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the carefully written words, each letter slightly uneven as though penned by a young hand, and the salutation alone was enough to stop him. "Dear Max," it began. And as his eyes moved down the page, the story began to take shape. The letter written in the voice of a child who loved her dog more than anything in the world, thanking him for walking her to the bus stop every morning, for keeping her warm when she was sick, for never leaving her side, even when she cried. And at the bottom, beneath a wobbly heart drawn in blue pen, was a line that made his throat tighten. "If anything ever happens to me, take care of him. He will know what to do." And Jack looked up at the shepherd, now knowing his name without needing to be told, and felt the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. Because this was not just an animal who had found something precious. This was a dog fulfilling a promise. And his mind began piecing together the third item, the small cylindrical object glinting faintly in the weak daylight, and when he lifted it, he saw it was a tiny silver whistle. The kind you might give a child for safety, worn smooth along the edges from years of being held. The engraving on one side barely visible but still legible enough to read the initials ER. And though Jack did not yet know who ER was, he could feel the shape of the story forming: a little girl, her dog Max, and something that had separated them but not broken the bond that tied them. And as Kyle stepped closer, reading the letter over Jack's shoulder, he muttered that they should get back to the station, that there might be records, that someone might still be looking for this dog or for the person who wrote these words. But Jack hesitated because the way Max pressed himself to the bundle told him that leaving the lake without understanding more would feel like leaving a book half-freed. And so, instead of rushing, Jack knelt down beside Max, showing him the mitten, the letter, the whistle, speaking softly as if the dog could confirm each memory with the slightest flick of an ear. And the wind around them seemed too quiet for a moment, the snow easing just enough to reveal the distant line of trees along the far shore. And Jack felt a pull toward that direction, as though the truth they sought was not at the station but somewhere out there, beyond the lake, in whatever place these items had come from. And the look in Max's eyes told him the dog knew exactly where that was. Now, before I tell you what happened when they decided to follow him, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is, because the final part of this story will bring every moment together. And it will make you see why Max's vigil on that ice floe was the most extraordinary act of loyalty you've ever heard. The decision was made without words, a quiet understanding passing between Jack, Kyle, and the others as Max stood at the edge of the dock, his body angled toward the distant tree line as if he'd been waiting for this moment. And when Jack nodded, the shepherd set off at a steady pace, paws crunching through the thin crust of snow, glancing back occasionally to make sure they were following. The bundle now carefully wrapped again and carried in Jack's arms, and the path he led. The Mon skirted the lake before dipping into a narrow trail flanked by tall pines, whose branches groaned under the weight of fresh snow. The air colder here, but still filled with that strange electric pull that comes when you are closing in on the heart of a story. And though the trek was long, Max never slowed, his steps purposeful, his head lowering each time the wind shifted, as if catching scents hidden beneath the winter air, until finally the trees opened into a small clearing, where the remains of a cabin sat half-collapsed under the weight of years and weather. The wood gray and splintering, the front door hanging by one hinge, and as they stepped inside, there, boots disturbing a layer of undisturbed frost, it was clear no one had lived here in a long time. Yet in the corner of the single room, there was a small bed frame, the blanket still faintly patterned with the same pastel squares as the quilt. From the lake, and at its foot, a second mitten, matching the one Jack carried, lay curled in on itself as though still waiting for a small hand, and beside it, tacked to the wall with a rusted pin, was a photograph, a girl no more than 8, her hair tucked. Beneath a knitted hat, her arms wrapped tightly around Max, both of them grinning against a backdrop of snow, and in the corner of the photo, written in blue pen, were the initials ER, the same as on the whistle, and beneath that, a date from 3 winters ago. And as Jack studied it, the pieces fell into place. A child who had likely ventured onto the lake with her sled and her dog, perhaps caught when the ice shifted, perhaps unable to make it back, and in the chaos, Max had done the only thing he could, guarding what little remained of her, carrying her treasures to the safest place he could find, and holding vigil until help arrived, a vigil that had stretched through days, maybe longer, through freezing nights and the endless howl of wind, until the fishermen had spotted him. And now, standing in the quiet of that cabin, Jack felt the weight of what it meant, that a dog could keep a promise beyond the limits of time, beyond the absence of the one who had given it. And as he knelt to place the mitten and whistle on the bed, Max stepped forward, resting his head against Jack's knee in a gesture that was not grief alone, but relief, as though the circle had finally closed. Outside, the snow began to ease, a pale sun breaking through the clouds, casting light across the frozen lake they had crossed. And Jack knew this was where Max's story would turn, that he would not be left to wander alone again, that from this day forward he would be a living reminder of the kind of loyalty that asks for nothing and gives everything. And as they led him back toward the warmth of the waiting truck, Jack looked down at him and murmured that the girl would be proud. That he had done exactly what she asked, and maybe more. And if you've stayed with this story until now, I want you to tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Because somewhere out there, another Max is keeping another promise. And maybe, just maybe, someone will hear this and go looking before it's too late.